Hello everyone, Professor Krislik here. So I wanted to make a follow-up video looking again at this central question from our reading of when and why do governments repress dissent. So both of our readings for this week looked at this from slightly different angles. One focused on what happens at protests, and the other looks more broadly at how states use repression across political systems. But when we take them together, they help us understand when repression is used, and it helps us understand that repression is not inevitable. There's times where repression simply does not occur. So it just helps us understand a little better when, why, and how repression is used. So a couple big takeaways from the readings are that repression is not random, but it's also not constant, and it is not uniform across cases, regime types, or countries. Instead, our authors are arguing that repression is strategic. It is a strategic tool some regimes use. So our first reading, Christian Davenport's article asks a relatively, seemingly simple question. Are all authoritarian regimes equally repressive? And the answer, according to their research, is clearly no. So Davenport defines repression as coercive state actions by the state to control political behavior. Things like arrests, censorship, surveillance, torture, and even killing. But the key theoretical contribution from their piece is that he treats repression as the results of decision-making processes. Governments weigh the benefits of repression, like maintaining political order, the costs, like backlash, maybe loss of legitimacy, or international pressure, the availability of alternatives, like elections, parties, and institutional channels for power, and of course, the likelihood of success. So repression happens when it is useful, feasible, and relatively low cost. So here's a way that Davenport really contributes to the literature. And much of the other literature on state repression, it has treated all autocracies as basically the same. But Davenport argued that different types of authoritarian regimes operate quite differently. So in personalistic regimes, something that you've probably encountered if you've taken me for comparative politics courses, or maybe my dictatorship to democracy course, we talk about and read about personalistic regimes where power is concentrated in a single leader. These tend to be highly repressive because they lack institutional alternatives and rely heavily on coercion. Single party regimes tend to be slightly less repressive because they can channel participation through controlled institutions. And military regimes fall somewhere in between, oftentimes shaped by organizational norms and coercive expertise. So this leads to what Davenport calls a kind of tyrannical peace. The idea that some authoritarian systems can maintain stability with lower levels of overt repression than others. So the key takeaway for Davenport is this: repression varies depending on institutional structure and strategic initiatives. So when we think of why we read a piece like this in American government context, it is helpful to understand the complexity and the nuance of how states respond to protests. What might seem like just normal political participation in a democracy, in an authoritarian regime, is oftentimes met with repression, but not simply all regimes just answer with repression. There is some variation there. So even in an American government course, it is worth reading, at least giving Davenport a skim and understanding what the argument is. So now let's shift from that macro understanding to more of a nuanced micro level. And this is Earl, Soule, and McCarthy. These authors ask a bit of a more specific question. When do police actually repress protests? And then try to understand why. Their study looks at protest events in New York State from 1968 to 1973, a period we often associate with heavy-handed policing. So there are some surprises in the reading, though. And the first major finding might come as a surprise. Most protests did not experience repression. In fact, police weren't even present at many events. This seems to directly challenge the common narrative from the 1960s, and certainly the common narrative about authoritarian regimes where the regime responds forcefully. So this idea that the 60s, or in an authoritarian regime, that police are constant, aggressive, always utilizing repression, these are authors saying no, that is a misunderstanding of how policing has worked in a democracy with protests. So instead, our authors argue that repression varies across events, and we need to explain that variation. So, similar to our in-class exercise we see that there are three core explanations for repression. The authors identify several of these really competing explanations for why repression occurs. The most important are the threat model. This is the most supported explanation in their research. The idea here is quite simple. The more threatening the protest is, the more likely it is to attract police attention and repression. So that threat increases when protests are large, when protests are confrontational, and their goals are radical or disruptive to society. Empirically, the authors find the strongest support for this idea that most protests will be left alone unless they are overly large, confrontational, and radical. Police then are more likely to show up and to escalate force when protests appear to have these characteristics, especially when they are threatening. So, we also see the weakness model, where the idea of focusing on threat, the focus is then on who is protesting. The idea is that governments are more likely to repress groups that are less able to respond, or that are less likely to be able to respond. And this might be marginalized groups, poor communities, groups with fewer organizational resources. These groups are thus seen as safe targets for repression. So here the authors are arguing that repression is not just about danger, but also about opportunity. And the most severe repression occurs when these two factors combine. That is, a protest is highly threatening and the participants are politically and institutionally weak. This creates a situation where authorities both want to repress and can do it with minimal cost. Maybe there's not much attention to the group being paid. So that kind of encapsulated what our in-class assignment looked at. When we looked at different types of protests, different, if they are big, small, or maybe extreme. Do they have much media attention? So that's kind of encapsulating what we were trying to do with our in-class assignment. So one of the most important contributions of this article is kind of conceptual. The authors argue that repression is not just a single decision. It's a two-stage process. One, will police show up? And if they do, what will they do? This matters because different factors influence each stage. For example, threat predicts whether police are present at all. But weakness helps explain how aggressively they act once they are there. So this helps explain why some protests are simply ignored, while others are met with arrest and force. So I just wanted to make that follow-up video, kind of giving less of a placing these two pieces in the theoretical context of political participation and protest, and simply talk about what these two pieces were saying. Thank you.